Well, again, welcome. As I've reflected on this, that better? I'm getting signs from the back. Before I was getting signs from above. I'm not sure how to interpret that. One of the great things about being in Augsburg is the quality of the people with whom we get to work. And the person we're going to hear from today, Dr. Frankie Shackelford, you all know quite well. Most of you know her very well, and so there probably isn't much I could tell you about her that you don't already know, or at least nothing that she'd want me to tell you about her. And I'll leave that to her. But there are a couple things as I reflect on the time that Frankie has been at Augsburg, what I've observed both directly and indirectly, and there are a number of traits that describe why she is such a wonderful colleague. She is far and away one of the most devoted friends that I know to many of us. She is indeed a caring colleague. I was looking at some different perspectives on colleague, and one of the things that I found intriguing about it is that its colleagues are people who are explicitly united in a common purpose, that respect each other's abilities toward that purpose, and Frankie embodies that. She has been a mentor to students and to colleagues, probably to many of us in this room. That is, she imparts her wisdom and shares her knowledge freely. She is also a loving critic of this college. She loves this institution, but she's also is a loving critic and serves us well in that regard. And probably most importantly, she's a gifted teacher. We hear the expression that people say, I quote unquote love teaching, and I don't doubt that when people say that. But when Frankie says it, I think she really means it, and you can see it. And she loves her students, and she loves the opportunity to be with them and to learn with them and to teach them. It truly is my great privilege to invite Frankie Shackelford to the podium, and she's going to speak to us about God's sticky notes, the silent call. Frankie.
Good afternoon, and thank you for being here. When I look around this room at 100 colleagues, and I know I'm among friends, but what's not comforting is that at least 92 of you have come up to me or sent me emails telling me what high expectations you have of today's presentation. Furthermore, a number have said that they hope that I will elaborate on those 3 things that I mentioned publicly last year that help sustain me in my work, namely swimming, sex, and red wine. Sorry, folks, this is a serious talk. And it's not about how I cope with being a workaholic. It's about why I came to be one. I'm going to try to make sense of my calling to this work in the context of a long journey from pre-civil rights Texas to post-Christian Cedar Riverside. It's not so much a theological exploration of vocation as a phenomenological one. How certain experiences across the years have left indelible traces on me and come to fruition here at Augsburg College. Okay, not surprisingly, we're going to start with a little language lesson. I'll not ask for a show of hands, but those of you who've read Wittgenstein know about those German unprefixes. In the English version of the Tractatus, Wittgenstein claims confidently, everything that is not the case is accident. Huh? This becomes much clearer when you see the German word for accident, Unfall, the uncase. Norwegian has the same love of the unprefix in a sleeker Nordic form, just a U. A friend, for example, is a venn, and an enemy is an uvenn, an unfriend. Grass is gräs, and weeds are ugräs. Whole years can become unyears, uoid, when the harvest goes really wrong. In English, however, we've mostly reserved the un for adjectives. unusual, unimportant, unknowable, until some advertising genius, probably a German immigrant, came up with the un-cola, where un indicates a positive deviation. Likewise, what I hope to tell you today is the story of how Frankie Shackelford became an un-Texan and found her calling at an un-college in the North. Long ago and far away, in a working-class neighborhood on the northern outskirts of Houston, I enjoyed a happy childhood with all the basic necessities: a doll, a cowgirl outfit, and a bicycle that one could pretend was a horse. Oh, and a little sister to herd around. Our family went to rodeos. Daddy judged livestock. C&W music flowed 24/7 from our neighbors' open windows. We watched the Cisco Kid, Roy Rogers, and Hopalong Cassidy on TV. We remembered the Alamo, and we ate lots of Tex-Mex food, as you will note from those chubby cheeks. But already in elementary school, I was introduced to Scandinavia in geography lessons and as costume at the Garden Oaks Elementary School Mayfete, where in 1955, the fourth graders appropriated the identity of Swedish peasants. And my little sister Johnny, still in kindergarten, was a Laplander, before we learned that they should be called Sami. Who could imagine I would one day write a dissertation on a Swedish author, or teach Sami culture and literature, or invite actual live Sami people to my Keystone course? At the age of 10, I left Texas for the first time on a family road trip to Chicago, where my father, a very blue-collar AV equipment repairman, had been given the honor of representing his boss at a national convention. And this was a big deal. My mother sewed look-alike outfits for little Frankie Bell and Johnny May, now reinvented as un-cowgirls. The world opened up as we headed north, and my love of travel was born. A year later, the Russians launched Sputnik, and schools across the nation took up the challenge. In junior high, the serious students actually dedicated most afternoons to doing homework, ate dinner with their families, washed our own dinner dishes, and then spent evenings talking to friends on white or beige so-called princess phones, which, although then it was considered a slim model, would be able to gobble up about 30 of the iPhones of today. Big hair. Meanwhile, our parents taught Sunday school, led Girl Scout troops, organized carpools, and watched the Lawrence Welk Show, or Bonanza, before collapsing into bed after the 10 o'clock news. Our lives were dictated by routine and discipline. The 1950s was a time when, as Wallace Stevens put it, Bishop's books still ruled the world. This is kind of dark. I have to tell you, these slides are, they are from the 1950s, and I want to thank Scott Krenz for helping me scan these things because they were in pretty bad shape. I should also say at this point that if you were looking forward to loads of gorgeous pictures of Norway, you came to the wrong lunch. I'm sorry. I went to St. Matthew's Methodist Church twice on Sundays, and to choir practice every Wednesday, was president of the Methodist Youth Fellowship, the MYF, and dutifully joined the periodic altar calls when Reverend Curtis smiled his beckoning smile and urged us to come forward and dedicate our lives to Christ. If a rift had appeared in a dazzling Texas sunset and a voice had called me to a life of service, I would have followed right then and there. But the sky never opened and the call never came. Some shriller soundtrack, probably the voice of Roy Orbison, must have distracted me. Besides, I was listening for my princess phone to ring. St. Matthew's became, unfortunately, an emblem of discrimination, both racial and gender-based. Racism was endemic in the Texas of my childhood. African Americans who had errands in white neighborhoods always came humbly to the back door, and public facilities were clearly demarcated by race. I recall being scolded at Sears for drinking out of the water fountain marked colored. My father, naturally, was the AV guy at church, too, and since he was always setting up mics and speakers, he did a lot of work with the custodian, an African American named George. The only time I can remember seeing my father cry was a Monday evening when he came home from a meeting of the church board where he had proposed that George be allowed to join the congregation as the first black member. His petition was denied, and when he came home to tell Mother about it, he burst into tears. This image stuck, one of the first in the series I'm calling God's Sticky Notes. It etched a desire for social justice that pushed me into college politics as an undergrad and is one of the reasons why I resonate so strongly with Augsburg's commitment to diversity. The summer after 8th grade, I was in a car accident. This being before seatbelts were standard equipment, I was tossed from the front to the back seat by the impact. Dr. Paul Harrington, a pioneering orthopedic surgeon to whom I owe my health and longevity, would later explain that this had injured the growth cells in my spine and caused me to develop scoliosis. Half of them kept growing, the other half went dormant. I got an S. Perhaps this was exacerbated by all the jumping I did as a 9th grade cheerleader. I underwent physical therapy for 2 years and received a dire prognosis that I would be confined to a wheelchair by age 45, unless I underwent radical, still experimental surgery. I signed on for spinal fusion and instrumentation in February of my junior year in high school. 10 of my vertebrae were fused. 3 steel Harrington rods were implanted along my spine. You can see those in the photo. Not mine, but the ones he normally used. And after 17 days in the hospital, I lay in bed in a body cast for 6 months, hardly able to move. I was lavished with daily visits by my many friends, back when friends showed up in person and not just as status updates on Facebook. I was provided round-the-clock care by my tireless mother, who claimed the world's record for most bottles of Dr. Pepper served in a single 6-month period. I had teachers for the homebound provided by the Houston Public Schools and completed the credits to move on to senior year with my class. I watched spring come by holding a long-handled mirror like a periscope up to the window behind my bed. Longed to lose the hot, itchy cast that was now covered with signatures, and was finally allowed to get up, still wearing it, for 5 minutes 3 times a day, for 2 weeks, then 10 minutes 3 times a day, then 20 minutes 3 times a day. I had to learn to walk again, slowly rebuilt the atrophied muscles in my legs, and reluctantly gave up the dream to be an officer of the Imperial Guard, our high school drum and bugle corps. Instead, I concentrated on academics, joined the debate team, edited our high school newspaper, and on graduation the next spring was voted most likely to succeed. But succeed at what? In those days, success for a girl was squeaking through your BA just right before you got your MRS. And after my long period of medical captivity, I was more than eager to go off to college. Our counselors in high school urged me to apply to Rice University, which you probably know is in Houston. But that was a city where, in my mind, everything that was wrong with pre-civil rights Texas was epitomized. So, in the fall of 1964, I enrolled at Texas Christian University in Fort Worth, Cowtown. For the most part, I ignored the stockyards, although I did like the barbecue. Studied history and literature and comparative religions, Darwinism, Marxism, existentialism, and psychology. So now, fortified with new knowledge, unsettled by new questions, if God was calling, hey, I was no longer listening. I wanted to make my own path and follow it as far from the Lone Star State as possible. Recognizing, sadly, that I lacked the physical capacity to meet the recently assassinated President Kennedy's challenge to our generation, I watched in awe as my boyfriend Richard headed off to Turkey to serve in the Peace Corps. That route was not open to me, but because I was now majoring in psychology, I chose a study abroad program in Vienna, birthplace of psychoanalysis, for my junior year. Of course, my lower middle-class parents could not afford this program, but when I was awarded a partial scholarship, they caved in and covered the difference, sacrificing both their own dream of moving into a brick house, which was the ultimate, and their peace of mind. I recall my father's consternation. Why would anyone want to study German after World War II? And my girlfriend's dismay. Why would anyone want to abandon our little sisterhood of lives interwoven for 16 years. I knew my mother's worst fears. What would become of the obedient daughter she had nursed back to health, only to see her lured away, first by the irreverent lyrics of Bob Dylan, then by the godless science of psychology, and now a year in Europe with rich kids from the East Coast who probably smoke dope? That August of 1966, Mom and Dad and Johnny drove me to New York City and dropped me off at the pier where the old, imposing, and elegant Queen Elizabeth was docked. Families were allowed on board for a few hours before we set sail. But when they were back on shore, waving frantically, and the ship's horns bellowed departure, the world's toughest umbilical cord snapped. My love of sea voyages began on that journey, the first of 4 transatlantic crossings I've made. Terrible slide, but you get the color. It's amazing. Out in the middle of the Atlantic is so, so blue. The next 11 months were a quest for independence and the beginning of what decades later I can see as the discernment of a calling. We claim that hindsight is 20/20. In retrospect, we see everything so clearly. But is there an oral analog? Is there such a thing as hind hearing? A reverb that rings truer than the original note? What happens when we listen back? Can we perceive a call overheard in the clamor of youth? Vienna was the city of Mozart and Strauss, and I was listening intently that year, but not to a voice from heaven. The Viennese dialect, Wienerisch, was as aberrant in German as my Texan drawl is in English, which nobody in Austria could understand. I needed to get rid of it. Besides, the U.S. was mired down in Vietnam, and who wanted to sound like Lyndon Johnson? My roommate from Rochester, New York, which has its own strange dialect problems, and I neutralized each other's accents as quickly as possible. But I also studied German night and day and never left home without my dictionary. By the beginning of the spring term, I was able to enroll in regular psych courses at the University of Vienna, including a large lecture class on existential analysis by the Viktor Frankl, author of Man's Search for Meaning, a title that resounds here in our Religion 100 courses. We observed Frankl talk with survivors of concentration camps in an attempt to reground their lives. His work stuck on my mental screen, another providential post-it note on the road to Augsburg College, a place I would not become aware of for another quarter century. During the winter break, I traveled to Turkey to visit Richard, put on body-cloaking shalvars, and found my place among the women in their gender-separate social life. I sat on a dirt floor after dinner and watched 2 pregnant women dance in the center of the room, rubbing their bellies together as another woman crouched in the corner, beating a rhythm on a tin wash basin and singing in a non-Western scale. They welcomed me warmly, without language. I was also invited to breakfast with the mayor of Fevzia's family and served hot, sweetened water buffalo milk, which I took as a goodwill gesture toward the Peace Corps and the U.S. generally. Being an American in Europe in the late 1960s was not a comfortable identity. And being a Texan was extra cause for suspicion. Texans shot JFK, didn't they? Did I carry a gun? Did I ride a horse to school? But in rural Turkey, I was treated with great respect, unlike in Istanbul, where men clicked and elbowed me as I walked through the streets with my long hair uncovered. This initial, if contradictory, encounter with Muslim culture was actually more intriguing than alienating, and it put another sticky note in my mind: learn more about Islam. It would be decades before I developed my first close Muslim friend here in the Somali diaspora in Minneapolis, Binti Ahmed. Did the women dancing in Fezia or the calls to prayer in Istanbul make me more receptive to echoes years later in Cedar Riverside? Other experiences were equally transformational that spring. Luckily, in her wildest dreams, my mother could not have imagined that on the 1st of May, Labor Day, in the communist world, I would be smuggling papers out of Czechoslovakia for a hockey player who had defected to Austria. This is a story many of you have heard that added passion to my latent sense of calling, but I'm not going to tell that story here today. If you want to read it, it's in a back issue of Till and Keep. I began to see myself as a connector. I wanted to work across cultural barriers, serve as a bridge between peoples. Should I aim for the diplomatic corps or become a translator for the UN? I applied for a summer course in Kiel in northern Germany, and there I fell in love with a German medical student, which was a boost to my language skills. Our romance was short-lived, but on returning to Cowtown, I decided to complete a second major in German. I did my senior honors thesis in psycholinguistics, and I thought about grad school in that field, but in another sleight of unseen hand, I was awarded a Fulbright Fellowship for further study in Germany. While in Hamburg, I became interested in the influence of German literature in Scandinavia, maybe because my best friend at the summer school in Kiel had been a Dane, or maybe because my professor in translation theory at the University of Hamburg was a Swede, but mainly because I was planning to spend the following summer in Finland. Was I picking up some faint call from the north? Notice that Norway has not been mentioned yet. This is Norway, and it's from the 2000s, and so it's completely postmodern to have it at this spot. But this is my call from the north, okay? In Hamburg, in the spring of 1969, I took a beginning course in Swedish, which I was able to put to use in Finland, where Swedish is the second language. I helped organize a summer camp for the World Council of Churches on Lake Näsijärvi near Tampere, where young people from a dozen countries worked to rehab an old barge from the Winter War for use as a dormitory. The locals all invited us to their saunas and served us sausages, and in July 1969, we crowded around a tiny TV set in the living room of a Finnish farmer's house to watch the American moon landing. I learned some basic phrases and songs in Finnish, and in Sweden, on the way back home, I made a pilgrimage to Uppsala to the gravesite of Dag Hammarskjöld, the legendary UN Secretary General. Once again, the dream of working for the UN, being an ambassador for world peace, left its trace on the backdrop where Vocation was taking shape. Starting on grad school in Germanic languages at UT Austin, and I love to tell this story to students because they're so worried about making the right career choices, I found that Providence had failed to provide the University of Texas with a Swedish professor. This was to be my second language for the PhD. We'll get a Swedish professor next year, they said. I waited, no Swedish. So I settled for the next best thing, Norwegian. The best decision I never made. How random was that? Indeed, how random was that? Meanwhile, I got a TA-ship to teach beginning German and was blessed with mentors who faithfully visited our classes and gave helpful feedback. There were around 30 German TAs at UT and a very lively program of teacher development, mutual class planning, all-night grading sessions, and a gigantic joint office filled with old oak desks and cigarette smoke where we all hung out in an atmosphere that promoted intellectual dialogue and probably lung cancer. And we shared our teaching stories. I was hooked. Never mind the UN. Forget the diplomatic exam. A teaching life was clearly the path for me. In 1973, I got a fellowship to study at the University of Oslo and then returned to Austin to teach Norwegian for the last 2 years of grad school. So when I was ABD, I applied for 42 jobs in German and got one offer, assistant professor and dorm mother in the German house at Douglas College, which is the girls' unit of Rutgers. But I also applied for the only opening in Norwegian nationwide and got it, a 2-year instructorship at UW-Madison. So long, farewell, auf Wiedersehen, goodbye to my career in German. Madison was the Austin of the North, affectionately known as Madtown, a large and liberal university where I felt instantly at home. so much so that I didn't want to leave. I fell in love again, this time with a student in the very first class I taught. A student in the very first class I taught. This is a story I won't tell here, as it will compromise all the work I've done on the employee handbook. Suffice it to say that we have now been married for 34 years, but at the time, Jolie was still finishing his BA, so there was little incentive for me to move on. The Department of Scandinavian Studies in Medicine was a model mix of collegiality and high standards, and the Nordic welfare state, still vigorous and envied, helped us to attract a lot of students to the field. I finished my dissertation and returned to Oslo for a semester of intensive study of literature, but my temporary appointment at UW was renewed again and again and again, while Jolie finished his BA, MA, and PhD in the history of science. Along the way, we restored a Norwegian immigrant log house with no electricity or running water, and our two sons, Gorm and Leif, were born. We raised kids, sheep, goats, more kids, and vegetables, and eyebrows of quite a few skeptical friends. Going back to the land was more romantic than lucrative, and it was really hard work. I had to cluster 5 kerosene lamps on the dining table at night to grade papers and transfer embers from the parlor stove to the cook stove in the morning to make coffee. We did haul the laundry to town, and I took showers at the UW natatorium while the children had their baths at Grandma's house after school. I did not feel called to life in the 19th century. It was instructive to learn to spin. I'm glad I can can tomatoes. I know how to survive on my own garden. I continued to teach part-time, and I enjoyed what was probably, Velma, the most balanced part of my life. Twice we left the log house so that Jolie could do dissertation research in Denmark and Norway. In Oslo in the winter of 1987, I took on my first major translation project, a Norwegian novel. Then back in Wisconsin the next year, I submitted the manuscript and won the annual translation prize of the American Scandinavian Foundation. Leaving Jolie and the boys in the woods, I traveled to a highly electrified hotel in New York to receive the award. At the reception, a rep from Garland Press waltzed up and asked if they could publish my translation in their new series on world literature, which gave me the very, very wrong impression that publishing literary translations in the U.S. was a breeze. Translation was lonely work, and though the woods were lovely, dark, and deep, and full of snow, I had, vague professional promises to keep. The call, after 6 years of living in the log house, the call of the wild was drowned out by the need for modern conveniences and a more reliable income. There was no tenure-track position for me at UW-Madison. When Jolie defended his dissertation in the spring of 1989, I was director of the Oslo Year, a study abroad program for American college students at the University of Oslo. Our employment prospects were dim. We were applying for positions in 2 of the world's narrowest specializations, contemporary Norwegian literature and early modern history of medicine. Not medicine, history of medicine. The previous autumn, before we left for Oslo, I had interviewed for a job at an obscure Lutheran college in Minneapolis with a German name. Maybe my vision of teaching both German and Norwegian at the same place would be realized. For his part, Jolie was applying for postdocs, and in March, he accepted a Rockefeller grant at the University of Oklahoma in Norman. Just 2 weeks later, Dean Ryan LaHerde, whom many of you know and remember, called me with a job offer from Augsburg College. From a phone booth at the University of Oslo student housing, cramming krone after krone into the slot, I sadly reported that I would not be able to teach Norwegian at Augsburg. And off we went. Surely this was some kind of cosmic joke. Had I escaped Texas, only to be trapped for a year in its Siberian equivalent, Oklahoma? To preserve my sanity, I became a soccer mom and worked as a volunteer in the library at our boys' grade school. That fall of 1989, I watched the remaking of Europe as the Berlin Wall came down. That's a photo.